While CodePipeline is a tool that brings many other AWS services together, it also has some internal structures that are important to learn. How these structures work, the different configuration options, and how they interact is essential to understand to make the most of CodePipeline. Let's start by looking at CodePipeline as a whole. Each individual instance of CodePipeline is itself called a pipeline. This contains all the configuration options for that pipeline, as well as a minimum of 2 to a maximum of 10 stages in each pipeline. And inside those stages, 1 to 50 actions. We'll go into each of these in more detail in a bit. A pipeline is able to carry a type of state between each action and stage by using input and output artifacts. These artifacts are just files, whether it's your input source code, pipeline status files, or a build application binary. They are stored in an S3 bucket. This is the main way your actions will interact with each other in CodePipeline. Any input or output artifacts are defined in the action itself and are distinguished by a unique identifier name. If you need to input an artifact that was output from a previous action, you only need to reference it by the name as an input artifact, and CodePipeline will retrieve it from the pipeline S3 bucket. Now let's take a deeper look at the configuration options for a pipeline. Pipelines need a name to identify themselves. These only need to be unique in the same region of your account. A pipeline will need a service role, which will give it access to things like Lambda, S3, code commit, and the many other resources that CodePipeline interacts with. An S3 bucket will need to be created or designated to store the input-output artifacts used and created by the pipeline. Finally, you can designate your own KMS encryption key for the artifacts in the S3 bucket, or you could just use the default AWS encryption key. Besides these configuration options, the only other thing a pipeline contains is a number of stages. As I mentioned earlier, a pipeline must have at least 2 stages and can have no more than 10 stages. A stage is really just a collection of actions. You can use them to organize and isolate different types of actions according to whatever criteria you want. One of the most basic examples is to have a source stage, which contains an action that pulls code from source control and outputs a source code artifact, and a build stage, which contains a few actions which take that source code artifact and run some build commands on it. Stages are yours to use to structure your pipeline as you want. The only real requirement is that the first stage must contain 1 or more source actions and nothing more. Also, in my experience, I've noticed that the transitions between stages does add a little bit of latency to your pipeline. Not too much, but I've noticed it's enough to where I've started using stages very conservatively. In each stage is at least 1 action, with a maximum of 50 actions allowed. An action is where the magic of a pipeline happens. There are a few different types of actions, and each one performs some type of function. Let's go through each available action type in CodePipeline. The first is the source action type. This action type can only appear in the first stage and pulls in source code from one of these providers. The next action type is the build type. These actions run a job on one of the available build providers. Typically, this is where you would build or compile the code for your application. If needed, you can also have some arbitrary code run on a code build job. Say if you wanted to run some commands using the AWS CLI, for example. An important part of automated deployment is automated testing, and the test action type is how you can implement that in your pipeline. There are many different providers for the test action type, including various third parties, and also just using code build to run your tests. Typically, towards the end of your pipeline, you'll probably want to deploy your code, so you can use the deploy action type to perform that role. There are many different providers for deploying your application, including popular AWS services like CodeDeploy, ECS, and Elastic Beanstalk. And there are 2 more action types you may find useful. The first is the approval action type, which allows you to insert a manual approval into your pipeline. This can be really helpful when you've got a pipeline that deploys to production and you want someone to do a quick manual smoke test before the new version actually gets deployed. And the other action type is invoke, which allows you to invoke a Lambda function at some point in your pipeline. Finally, let's look at the creation of a pipeline. You can create a pipeline using the AWS console, moving through a wizard, or with CloudFormation by executing a template. I'm a big proponent of having your infrastructure in source control, so I highly recommend using CloudFormation for your pipeline creation. Another reason CloudFormation is preferable is that I've often found myself needing to create similar pipelines in different regions and for different applications. Using CloudFormation, it's pretty simple to change a few aspects of a template and then have a completely new pipeline up and running in minutes. In this course, we're going to create pipelines both ways so that you can see when you'd want to use either process.